essentially try and elaborate on the basis of my own work how the banking sector has been very, very integral to the way in which crony capitalism has evolved in India, and particularly which we see over the since over the last several decades. And I would want to then conclude by saying actually we are in fact moving ahead and in a sense going beyond crony capitalism to an oligarchy, where even among the capitalists there are a few favored lot and some who are not that favored. So, I mean, if you go back, as Professor Chandrasekhar and others have remarked in the past, when the banking system was largely nationalized from the early 70s onwards, it was very clear that if there's private ownership of banks, then whether it be agriculture, whether it be the small industries, they would not get their dues. And then what we saw is as this section evolved, by the late 80s, the cracks in the system had started showing. And people were questioning what was public about our public sector and what was private about our private sector. People were asking whether the public sector organizations were really run like the personal fiefdoms, like the personal jagirs on the zamindaris of some netas and babus, a few political leaders and their loyal bureaucrats. But what was very important was the private sector was really fueled by public money. And the promoters of these public organizations, they held a very small share of the total equity capital, the risk capital involved in setting up an enterprise. So whether it be Professor Goel or others who pointed this out, they said that the bulk of the money would come. Those days there was a clear differentiation between development financial institutions and scheduled commercial banks. So the working capital would come from the scheduled commercial banks, and the investment, the long-term investments in capital equipment would come from the development financial institutions. But the moot point and the real point is that the promoters held a minuscule share of the total investment. And the joke that used to do the rounds, it's a story that may not be true, but apocryphal, is that the Birla family had more shares in Tata Steel than the Tata family. But the people who had the shares really were the public sector, the financial institutions, the banks, as well as the insurance companies. And this came to the fore, if you will recall, when Swaraj Paul, as a non-resident Indian businessman, mounted hostile takeover bids on Escorts and Srinath, two venerable business houses based in the capital. And you are also aware that Mr. Swaraj Paul failed. People said he was very close to Indira Gandhi, but eventually what happened during Rajiv Gandhi's time, he stood by the status quo, and therefore whether it be LIC, whether it be the banks, they all stood by the existing promoters. And Swaraj Paul lost and backed out. So the hostile takeover attempts were not successful. From the 90s, the situation started changing. And the move towards liberalization, the move towards privatization started gradually gathering momentum. And that was when we first saw how crony capitalism would develop in this country, where industrialists, and this is also linked to political funding of political parties, funding of election campaigns, funding of individual politicians. And we see where we have reached today with the election bonds, where it is so amazing that what was started by the late Finance Minister Arun Jaitley as a move to bring about greater transparency in political funding has at today become the very instrument to ensure complete lack of transparency and opacity in political funding. We have, in fact, in that sense, taken steps backward. That is one of the consequences that we see of the trajectory of economic policies that have been followed by successive regimes. And certainly what we see in the last 6 years under the Modi government is an acceleration of these trends. Now, whether it be the Ambanis or Adanis, it is clear that they are hand in glove with the political establishment, and the banks have become instruments to help them. Look at what has happened. First, it was Dr. Raghuram Rajan. Then, if you read the recent books that have been written by Dr. Urjit Patel and Dr. Viral Acharya, they are very, very clear that the government of India, the Ministry of Finance, the political leadership clearly did not want a more accountable system, where if you have borrowed money that belongs to the people of this country, and you are using it and you fail to repay your loans, and then these become non-performing assets. The refusal to name them, the refusal to shame them. Dr. Raghuram Rajan said, yes, I've given an entire list to the Prime Minister. We can all guess what these names are, but to make it, they don't want to make it public. The then Central Information Commissioner, Sridhar Acharya, said, our Reserve Bank of India, you are responsible. You have to tell us what these names are. This is not a sort of official secret that you can't disclose. Who has taken money from you? Who has not repaid the money? But the refusal of the RBI to adhere to the provisions of the Right to Information Act is another retrograde step in this way the financial system has been moving and continues to move. Now, let's look at another aspect, which, if you are interested, the person who's done a lot of work on this is Hemendra Hazari. He has an analyst examined this myth that public sector banks are inefficient and private sector banks are super efficient. Let's first look at some examples in the public sector. We saw Punjab National Bank. The biggest fraud of its kind happened Nirav Modi, Mehul Choksi, and when the bank's own leaders blew the whistle, there was a huge hue and cry. Why? These were industrialists, these were business persons, these were traders whose links with the ruling establishment were very well known. And in fact, there was a formal function in the Prime Minister's house where he named Mehul Choksi because he was part of the gathering. But on State Bank and Reliance Jio, I'm going to talk a little later. But before that, look at what has happened in ICICI Bank. Mrs. Chanda Kochar was the poster girl of Indian banking. She was Mr. Kamat's protege. She was held up as the person who is going to bring about greater efficiency and the customers would love the kind of banking that she had, that she initiated in the ICICI Bank. And look at where she is today. Disgraced, accused of helping companies linked to her family members, her husband, her in-laws, and a failed businessman called Venugopal Dhut of Videocon. Look at what happened in Yes Bank. We have a family, the Rana Kapoor family, who indiscriminately loaned monies to some of the people, notorious defaulters, including the Anil Dhirubhai Ambani group, who claims he is bankrupt today, who managed to get out of jail because his older brother gave him money so that he could pay a company, a foreign company, just to stay out of jail. Now, what we are also seeing is, even say take the biggest of the private sector banks, HDFC Bank. Now, it's had the longest ever chief executive, Mr. Aditya Puri. No bank chairman has held that a post for 25 years, which Mr. Puri has. But as he's leaving, we see all the muck coming out. These controversies in the car loan department, a large number of people leaving that organization. And these people are saying, what, were you forcing people who took car loans to buy a GPS gadget, a geographical positioning system gadget? The amount of money may be small, but the way in which these things, unfair practices prevail in banks, in private banks that were held up to epitomize good governance. And this brings clearly that here's the Reserve Bank of India as the regulator of the banks, how they have not acted on time, acted late, and too little on many occasions. Whether it be Punjab National Bank and whether it be the connected to Yes Bank, to HDFC Bank, and a whole lot of other banks. As Professor Chandrasekhar pointed out, you've completely blurred today the distinction between what was supposed to be development financial institutions, what was supposed to be scheduled commercial banks, and what was supposed to be insurance companies. And you've got the LIC to bail out, you've got the other general insurance companies to bail out, and you've had this merger in the name that this is good because we need these large banks. Why? Because that's the way the world is going. But there's no logic, there's no justification, and I'm sure there are more people here who can speak in greater detail about the manner in which this was forced at the height of the pandemic and the economic slowdown. I want to talk a little bit about the Reliance Jio and the State Bank article, and I would suggest all of you who haven't had an opportunity, please do read it. So here is India's biggest privately owned corporate entity, headed by India's richest man. He's not just India's richest man, he's Asia's richest man. And according to one estimate, he's possibly the world's, some people say fourth richest, some people say eighth richest, it doesn't matter. He is among the richest men in the world today. Now, what has happened in this company, which was earlier, oil and gas was a major area of the business. And what we see is the oil and gas market has collapsed. As Comrade Franco has pointed out, if I've written a book to show how the manner in which the whole Krishna Godavari gas was sought to be allocated. And in that book, I argue that one of the most important reasons for the split in the Ambani family was not so much because Tina and Nita weren't the best of friends, but because they wanted to control resources that belong to the people of the country. And in this case, it was Krishna Godavari gas. And the whole thing became a bubble which is today not existent. The only problem is in the process, huge numbers of running into at least 30,000 crores, perhaps more than 30,000 crores, stranded assets which are unutilized, power projects, fertilizer projects, pipelines. So this is, in my opinion, a criminal waste of money in a developing country like ours. And mind you, all this happened during the UPA regime. But today, what we're also seeing in the NDA regime, and especially what has happened in the last 5 or 6 months, is an amazing story, the story of Reliance Jio. I'm also working on a book on the subject. It is under preparation. But here you see the economy in complete shambles. Economists are only arguing the extent to which it will shrink. Barring a few over-optimistic government economists, people are arguing, will the economy shrink by 3%? Will it shrink by 5%? Will it shrink by 10% or more in the current financial year? But what we see is this company suddenly attracting investments from across the globe. The two biggest, uh, uh, the two of the biggest digital monopolies, which happen to be also two of the biggest companies in the world at present, Google and Facebook. Now, just to give you an idea of how big they are both right on top in the list of the biggest corporate conglomerates in the world, whether you go to Fortune or Forbes or whichever classification you see. Now, when you look at Alphabet, the company which owns Google, it's not just Google, they also own YouTube and they also own the Android operating system. When you look at Facebook, you're not just looking at Facebook, you're also looking at WhatsApp and you're also looking at Instagram. Today, Facebook is in the news for all the wrong reasons because there's strong evidence that has come out about how it has been openly favoring the Bharatiya Janata Party, the ruling party, how it is refusing to take action against those who are spreading hate speech. But these two corporate conglomerates, if you look at Alphabet and Facebook put together, they account for over 90% of all the traffic that moves across the internet at any given point of time outside the People's Republic of China. That's how big they are. Now, both of these giants have tied up with Reliance Jio. Now, Reliance Jio was, till 2016, it was just one more player. Today, it is the biggest player. It's not just the biggest player in telecommunications and mobile data, internet data services. As Mr. Franco had pointed out, I've written a series of articles, you can have a look at them. See how the Reserve Bank of India's policies have helped. See how the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, their policies have helped. This one company more than others. The Ministry of Finance, at a time when everybody else is in a mess. The Securities and Exchange Board of India has tweaked its own rules. And the biggest beneficiary is Reliance Industries Limited. And then we have the classic case of the camel in the tent. I beg your pardon. Now, what we see is WhatsApp has been for some time wanting to have a payment system like Google. And it has been struggling to get that. And according to one view, today the Congress party held a press conference. They said very clearly that the reason why they were not doing anything against the government is because they wanted their approval of the Reserve Bank of India for their payments systems. And there was the whole issue of data localization, which was eventually sorted out. Now, the old story of the camel in the tent was like this, that it was a cold night and the master was inside the tent. And the camel said, "Can I put my nose in? It's very cold outside." And so the master said, "Yes, come in." And then he said, "Can I put my head in? Then can I put my body in?" And then the camel says, "This tent is not big for both of us, so why don't you go out?" Now, I am saying, will this happen? I hope not. And it depends on people like you, all of you. There are 139 of you as part of this meeting. You have to tell this is against national interest. It is not just that the State Bank of India is the biggest bank in the country in terms of number of employees, number of branches. Why should it be tying up with an entity which is yet to start operations and pick up 30%? And behind it, regretfully, is the former chairman and managing director of the bank, Mrs. Arundhati Bhattacharya, who 1 year after her cooling off period was over, soon after that, she joins the board of Reliance Industries Limited as its independent, quote unquote, independent additional director. So what we are today seeing is a movement that is now going beyond crony capitalism to oligarchy, to a few people who are benefiting from the system, and the system being manipulated in a manner in which it is even playing favorites among the big business houses in India. Now, in one sense, this is even going, we're not even going beyond economic ideology. We're not talking about socialism, we are not talking capitalism. this is not even capitalism. If the playing field is not level, then it's not even capitalism. I mean, if Jio could be where it is able to do so because it had a regulatory, there was a regulatory authority called the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, which series of orders, judgments, and a whole lot of decisions that were taken clearly favored this one group at the expense of others. Once upon a time, we had 15 companies vying with each other in the telecommunication space. Today, we are left with barely four, with Reliance Jio as the leader, and you have Sunil Bharti Mittal, Idea Vodafone desperately trying to struggle, and the public sector absolutely pushed to the margins. That's Bharat Sanchar Nigam Limited and Mahanagar Telephone Limited. So this is the way in which oligopolies or cartels are being formed at a time when there is widespread economic distress and the economy is in complete shambles. So the project, the privatization project is being pushed through at a time of great economic hardship. We've seen migrants. I think never before, perhaps in the history of humankind, have we seen such migration. In the period between 1945, 43, 44, the end of the Second World War till 47, 48, it is estimated that 15 million or 1.5 crore people were forced to migrate, and from the Punjab, from Bengal. What we've actually seen from the night of the 24th of March all the way through May, June, and July of this year, in terms of sheer numbers, that migration is bigger. Yet the government has been lying blatantly. The Union Home Secretary, the Solicitor General said there is no migrant. So you are in a post-truth world where the government is denying the reality on the ground. And in this kind of a milieu, we've had, for instance, this very famous kind of a claim by Nirmala Sitharaman that 10% of your GDP is going to go for a relief package. So if your GDP or gross domestic products is 200 lakh crores, you talked about a 20 lakh crore project, so-called relief package. But you look at it carefully, it's all old wine in a new bottle, old schemes being put together. And all the schemes, including the bank schemes, are all recycled. Now, how do you expect people to want to borrow more, even if you're giving them many sweeteners, when there's no demand? The recession is a demand-driven recession, but how do you expect liquidity and borrowing to people blame it out? The new additionality that has been added is probably very little. Now, when you look at 20 lakh crore, at one stage, you had your non-performing assets had reached 10 lakh crores. That was 0.5% of your GDP. Now your GDP is shrinking. NPAs are likely to grow more. I mean, it is not I who's saying this, it's the Reserve Bank of India itself who's saying this. So in this kind of a crisis, the push towards privatization, the push towards further weakening of public sector banks, the push towards cronyism and helping of a few oligarchies is, in my opinion, going to have it's going to have disastrous consequences for the country. And therefore, as people who work in banks, as people who are part of unions, part of associations, it is your responsibility to highlight how this is happening and to tell everybody you can how this must be opposed, because at the end of the day, it's not you and I, it's the interests of the public at large, the people of this country, which is at stake. So I'll stop here. Comrade Franco, I do not know if this was exactly what you wanted to hear. This was more about banking, which Professor Chandrasekhar, but I thought I'll add some of these elements, which are kind of like more dealing with political economy as well as crony capitalism and oligarchies. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to speak.